Shocking revelations on what life on a slave ship looked like. No one was supposed to know. Many European settlers were able to establish themselves as successful plantation owners in various locations in the Americas as a direct result of successful colonialism. The fast expansion of the plantation system across the American colonies led to an increase in the demand for labor that was both difficult and unpaid. This, in turn, led to the beginning of the horrific transatlantic slave trade, which continued for centuries. During the period beginning in 1500 and ending in 1800, over 26 million African people were sold into slavery and taken to various locations around the world, including the Americas. Due to the length of the journey and the harsh conditions they were forced to endure, millions of African people were killed while being transported across the ocean to be sold as goods, and this is just a glimpse into what life on a slave ship looked like. Many Europeans, Arabs, and even Chinese traders were involved in the slave trade for many centuries before the colonization of the Americas. This activity lasted for many decades and spanned numerous continents. The development of the plantation economy in the American colonies, on the other hand, led to a significant increase in the volume of the slave trade. The first shipment of Africans to arrive in colonial Brazil from Africa was made by the Portuguese in 1526, marking the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Almost immediately after that, a great number of merchants from Spain, Britain, France, Denmark, and the Netherlands followed suit and began trading in slaves. As a result of the participation in the slave trade, the slave traffickers grew enormously wealthy, while the countries that exported slaves saw a significant increase in their revenues. This was because the slaves supplied the colonies with the necessary workforce. Tens of millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homeland, robbed of their identities, and used as commodities between the 16th and 19th centuries. This practice continued well into the 20th century. Others were sold to Asians as well as African slave markets, and many of those who were enslaved ended up being a part of the triangle trade that ran between three continents. The movement of goods and the exchange of goods were integral parts of the triangle commerce system, which extended from Europe to Africa and then from Africa to the Americas. It is a convoluted trading system that enabled the buying and selling of various commodities on all three continents. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the journey from Africa to the Americas was known as the Middle Passage. It was estimated that the journey may take up to 6 months to complete, because the journey across the Middle Passage could be completed in a matter of weeks rather than months, because to developments in navigational technology made in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was an increase in the amount of human cargo that was transported. Slaves, along with cotton, tobacco, and sugar, were viewed not as human beings but rather as commodities that could be traded with plantation owners in the New World in order to generate enormous profits. The early slave ships were converted from commerce or cargo ships in order to carry the maximum number of slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. These ships were the forerunners of modern slave ships. As a direct response to the phenomenal growth of the slave trade, numerous ships that were purpose-built for the carriage of human cargo in greater quantities and for the purpose of increasing profits were eventually constructed. The living conditions aboard the ship continued to be deplorable and shockingly awful, despite the installation of new features such as portholes in the lower deck for the purpose of improving airflow. They were not allowed to stand up while they were on board because they were kept in compartments on the lower deck that had floor-to-ceiling heights of little more than 4 feet and half an inch. However, this is not the most difficult portion of the journey, because the male slaves on board were also shackled in pairs, and they were forced to sit with their shoulders pressed against one another for the entirety of the Middle Passage. This was not the worst part of the journey. Because of the exceptionally low mortality rate aboard the ship, it was not uncommon for slaves to be shackled together even after the other prisoner had passed away, and it could take the crew hours or even days to finally remove the deceased slave and throw their body overboard. According to a number of stories, the lowest decks of the slave ships gave off an odor that was a disgusting combination of death and sickness. Because the scent was so repulsive, it not only shattered the morale of the other slaves on board, but also harmed their physical health. The fact that male and female slaves were housed in separate compartments on the ships only served to encourage sexual assault and other forms of violence against the women who were held as property. In addition to adult males and females, children were also held as slaves on this ship. Unlike their adult counterparts, children were granted more freedom, which was frequently exploited by all slaves. The conditions in them were exceedingly unclean, and the fact that each of the slaves was tied to another slave and onto the various chains on the floor, which made the situation even worse. In addition to being crammed into the lower deck with hundreds of other slaves, the slaves were also chained to each other and to the many chains on the floor. Slaves may be brutally punished for the smallest infractions, the most prevalent of which was a form of torture known as the thumbscrew. This consisted of an apparatus that would progressively crush the victim's thumb while they were tied to a chair. When one takes into account the fact that the only ships that transported slaves allowed former convicts to serve as crew members, it is simple to understand how brutality and torture were not only commonplace, but also accepted behavior on these journeys. Slaves did not go hungry because it was necessary for them to go through the ordeal of being transported in order to be bought and sold, but they were only given the barest amount of food possible. Because it was not frowned upon by the captains, rape of female slaves was also extremely prevalent. The captain's only exception to this rule was when the act interfered with the journey's intended goal. As a result of all of these conditions, abuse and anxiety about what lays ahead, many slaves gave in to hopelessness to the point that they chose to take their own life at any opportunity that presented themselves. After everything that they had been through on board, it was unrealistic to think that life in the new country would be any better for them when they arrived there. They had witnessed unspeakable tragedies. Slaves had little concern for the lives of those who were enslaved because they were considered to be a commodity. As a result, murder was seen to be acceptable behavior among slaves. During the time of the Atlantic slave trade, it was extremely common practice to toss the slaves out to sea. This was done so that the owners of the ships could make an insurance claim for each slave that perished at sea due to drowning. Since sickness was not covered by insurance, the owners of enslaved people would generally toss them overboard when they were in their final stages of illness in order to guarantee payment. Since the insurance did not cover sickness, this would be their last resort in order to still get money from the loss. The most dreadful killing took place in 1781, when 130 Africans were thrown off of Britain's Zom slave ship. Although it is extremely frequent to drown slaves for a purpose, this event stands out as the most horrific. The protracted journey of the ship as it became lost at sea resulted in a lack of food and water supplies, which led to the death of a staggering number of slaves who had been held on board. Already the violent executions of Africans on board the slave ship generated chaos in the slave economy, which was already being shaken to its foundations by the growing number of Europeans who wanted the abolition of slavery. The Zong massacre stoked the flames of fury among abolitionists, whose efforts eventually led to the passage of the Slave Trade Act in 1788. Although the law merely regulated the shipping of slaves and did not put a stop to the trade altogether, the ratification of the stated act prepared the way for the total prohibition of the slave trade more than a decade later. This was because the law only regulated the transportation of slaves. There was also microaggression and colorism in various societies, which are additional forms of racism experienced by Africans across the globe. These forms of subtle and internalized racism continue to affect both the descendants of African slaves and those who remained in Africa. The passage concludes by inviting viewers to share any interesting facts that may have been missed and encourages them to subscribe for more content related to history's dark past. Click on the next video to discover strange things about Black history no one was supposed to know.